What's up, everybody? This is John from Coding Addict, and welcome to another JavaScript Nuggets video. And in this video, we'll continue discussing asynchronous code, and more specifically, how to use async await. Before we go into nuts and bolts, if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this video is this. At the end of the day, async await allows us to write async code in synchronous fashion instead of endlessly nesting callbacks. And the main points are following, where when we use async await, await will always wait till the promise is settled, but we can only use await if we have async in front of the function. That's one of the things I've noticed where once people learn about async await, they pretty much start using await all over their code. And you cannot do that. You can only use it if the function that you have set up is actually async. And also something very important to keep in mind that async function always returns a promise. And essentially this video will consist of two parts. First, I'm just going to show you a general example, and then we'll take a look at the more specific one and see how async await works in real life. And let's just start with general info, where I definitely want to showcase that a sync function will always return a promise. And I'll set up two functions, one, the traditional function, and the second arrow function, just so you can see a difference. And the first one is just going to be an arrow function. And the way we set up function as async is for the arrow function, we'll go with name. And then before the parentheses, we go with async. So now, of course, our function is going to be async. And then as far as the function body, I'll simply go with return and hello there. And what you'll notice, if you console log the example, and of course, you need to invoke it, you'll see that it is a promise. And of course, in this case, it is right away fulfilled since I'm just returning hello there. But that's something very, very important to keep in mind, where a sync function will always return a promise. Now, what about await? Well, let's set up another function. And in this case, I'm just going to use traditional function. And in order to set up traditional function as async, we need to go here with async and then, of course, function. And then what is going to be the name? I'm going to call this some func. And then I'll set up the function body. Now, once we use async, we can also use await. And as you can clearly see that, and as I already mentioned, await waits till promise is settled. So in this case, since we are returning a promise, what we could do here, we could go with const result, and we'll set it equal to await. And then, of course, we need to invoke the example. And then if we console log, we can see that, of course, we'll have the value. And once I set up my some func, I want to comment out this one here. And then I just want to invoke some func. Some func, we invoke it. And of course, in a console, I can see the value. Now, of course, normally this promise is going to be coming from some kind of function that returns a promise. I just wanted to showcase both things, where async will always return a promise. And then as far as the await, it will always wait for promise to settle. And then we can get the result. And essentially, you can think that we don't need to use those .thens. We simply go with, okay, let's wait for the promise to be settled, and then I'm going to have the result. As a side note, if the promise is not returning any kind of value, meaning remember when we covered the promises in resolve, sometimes you pass data in, sometimes you don't, you just resolve it. Then, of course, we don't need to assign it to a variable. Then you just say, hey, I want to wait for example, and then I'm good to go. And just to hammer this home, I want to do one more console log, and I'll just say hello world. And what you'll notice that hello world is only after the hello there. And essentially, this is the main goal, where we have a synchronous code because we're waiting for the promise to settle, but we can actually write it in a synchronous fashion. And just to give you a real life example, I'll comment this sucker out just so you can have it for your reference. And I think I'll remove both of these console logs. And then if you notice in the file, I have users, and essentially it is an array of objects. And then each user has the ID as well as name. And I also have the articles. And of course, typically we request such resource over the wire. So it's coming from the database, from the API and whatever. And usually, I mean, not all the time, but usually the structure is following where you have some type of items, whether that's users, customers, or whatever, and they're stored in one place. And then there is a separate list for orders, repositories, or something else along those lines. And in there, the items are assigned to the individual user. Imagine the scenario where you have the users, you have the articles, and then for the articles, I have the same deal. I have the array, but in this case, of course, I have the object, and in there, I have the user ID. So this user ID matches to that of the John, Susan, or Anna. And in here, I'm showcasing the articles. Now, of course, in order to make this shorter, I just went with 1, 2, 3. And of course, you can read the rest of the values, but the idea is following where John has these articles because the ID matches, and then Susan and Anna have these ones. Of course, in this scenario, I can simply set up as one function, but I want to showcase how would you do that over the wire? Because when you're requesting, when you're setting up the HTTP request, of course, it is going to be asynchronous. And that's why I set up some fake functions, meaning functions that return a promise, even though in this case, of course, we don't need to use it. I could have just set up one function, and the setup is following where I have function by the name of getUser, and in here we pass in the name, and then I return a promise. And then inside of that promise, of course, we pass into arguments, resolve and reject. And first thing that I want to do is find the user with that name. Now, if the user exists, I resolve it and I return a user. If not, then of course I spit back the error. And the same goes for articles, but you need to understand that, of course, this happens in sequence. Only once I get the user, only then I can get the articles. And in the articles, somewhat similar, where I pass in the user ID, which of course I'm going to get back from my get user, since I'll have access to it here. And then if the user has any articles, then of course I'll just get the articles, and I can do that since all the users have the ID. And then if I'm successful, of course, I return those articles. However, if something goes wrong, and if I cannot find any articles that match actually the user ID, then of course we'll reject it. And once we're familiar with my two functions, now I just want to showcase how we would do that using the typical .then approach. And we need to start by going with getUser. So of course, that is my function. It returns a promise, and you just need to pass in the string. So in my case, I'll start by passing in the correct user, and the name is going to be Susan. Then, since I know that this returns a promise, what do we need to do? We need to go with .then, correct? And then what we'll have access in the callback function, we'll have access to the data that we're passing into resolve. So in here, I can just say callback function, and for time being, I think I'm going to go with user. I'm not going to be particularly original, and I simply want to console log it. I simply want to showcase what is my user. Now, there also might be an error. So, of course, we'll go with catch, and then we'll console log that as well. So console log, and then I'm looking for the error. And once I save, of course, I should see the ID, correct? Again, the logic is following. I pass in the name, and if the name matches, then, of course, I'm getting the user. Now, if I pass in something that is not available in my resource, for example, Susan's, of course, now I'll have no such user with name, blah, blah, blah. Now, what's next? Well, I know that if my function returns a promise, the one that I'm passing here in a callback function, then of course, I can chain another .then. So once I have the user, what I could do? Well, I could invoke get articles, correct? So I'm going to go with get articles. And now I want to take that user ID and pass it over here. And the way we do that, we go with user. That's my object. And then what is the property? That is ID, of course, correct? So we go over here and we pass in the ID. So now, of course, I can chain another .then, and then I have another callback function. And in this case, of course, I'll have access to the articles because this function, get articles, returns the articles that match to the user. And let's go here again with log. And then I'm going to go with articles. So once we save, of course, I still have, there's no user Susan's because there isn't. And once I fix it, of course, now I have 4 and 5. Why? Well, because the user ID is the same as the ID for the Susan. And essentially, I just want to showcase this sequence where once you have multiple async operations, you'll have to start chaining these .thens. And this is where async await truly shines because we can actually make this code way more readable by refactoring our code to use async await. And as always, I'll leave this for your reference. So I'll just comment this out and we'll go above. And just so I don't use the same name, I'm going to go with const get data and I'll set it up as async. And for time being, I won't pass anything in. But what I want to do is go with const and then user. And then remember, when I use async, what I can use await. So in this case, I can set up await. So I can just stick it in front of the get user and just wait for that promise to be settled. So I don't have to go with those .then. I don't have to say, hey, get me the user and then do something. No, I'm just going to say await. And then let's go with get user. Again, it is important that we set up this as a function that returns a promise because that is the whole point over here. We're just waiting for that promise to be settled. And then, of course, we want to pass in the user. Now, since I want to be on the same page with you, I'm going to go with log and then user. And then if I invoke my get data, I should see in a console John. And of course I do. So once I have the user, now what I can do? Well, now I can check. I can say, hey, if the user exists, then get me also articles. If it doesn't, well, then I'm just not going to do anything. So let's scroll up where we have get data. Of course, we have our user. Awesome. And now let's just set up if user. So if it exists, then of course I want to get my articles. And how we can do that? Well, we have await and we have a function that returns a promise. So if we put 2 and 2 together and simply do something like this, where I go with await get articles. And then what do I need to pass in? Of course, the ID, correct? So I go with user and then .id. That is going to be that user ID over here. And then now, of course, I can have access to the articles. So I can go here and I can say articles. And of course, in a console, I'll see all the articles that John has. And I know that I keep pretty much repeating the same line, but take a look at our code here and take a look at our code over here. And you know what? At this point, I think I'm just going to comment out the console log for the articles, just so it's a bit cleaner. And you can clearly see that even though the code is pretty much doing the same thing, this one is way more readable because I go, okay, get me the user. If the user exists, get me the articles. Unlike here where we get the user and then we just start chaining .thens because of course from our callback functions, we're returning promises. Now, is this better than the endless nesting of the callback functions? Of course. But if you compare these two, you can clearly see why async await is preferred over chaining .then. And lastly, I just want to showcase, well, how we can handle errors. Because at this point, if I go with John's, then of course, again, I'll have a mess in a console. And essentially, we want to handle that gracefully. And in order to do that, we set up try catch block. And then the way it works, we go with our asynchronous operation. So we try to do that in the try block. And then if there is an error, of course, we'll take another action. Now, in this case, that another action simply going to be error. So console log the error. And then if we're successful, then of course we can do something with those articles. And if you enjoy mind grenades as much as I do, you'll definitely like this one. We actually don't need to check for the user. Why? Well, if we take a look at our code, we can see that since we reject the promise, if no such user exists, we're already handling that use case in the catch block. Let me demonstrate that. So if I were to go here and just remove this whole thing, of course, we can still see that there is no user by the name of John's, correct? And what I can simply do here is just say, get me the articles. So the code actually is going to stay exactly the same. And now, of course, we go with await. And now we're looking for get articles. And then we pass in the user. And again, the property was user ID. And if I'm going to get the error, of course, I'll right away see that in console, since that's how I'm handling the error. But if I'm successful, if I'm actually looking for the correct user, and of course, in this case, the name will be John, then of course, I'll be able to see my articles. Now, I removed the console log, that's why I cannot see anything. But if we go over here, notice now we have 1, 2, and 3. Now, if there's going to be some kind of error with my articles, for example, instead of passing in the ID, I decide that I'll pass in the name, we'll handle that in the catch block as well. So once I save it here, notice now I have wrong ID. And isn't this awesome? Where we have two asynchronous tasks, and yet we can write code in a synchronous fashion. Where I say, hey, get me the user by the name of John. And then once I get back the user, I can stick that value in the get articles. Now, of course, I just need to fix it. And I need to use the proper property. And then once I do that, of course, then I get my articles. And hopefully now you can clearly see why async await has become pretty much go-to when we need to handle asynchronous tasks.